you know, are also the ones where it's hardest to have and raise a healthy baby. So.
Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Ana Luisa Ramos. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Each year, the Hinckley Institute of Politics, David Eccles School of Business, Gardner Policy Institute, and Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative work together to host a series of events to promote principle-based ethics education. This year's theme is Ethics in Journalism. Today's forum is titled Ethical Journalism in the Beehive State, and we are excited to be joined by some great panelists. Katie McKellar is a writer for the Utah In-Depth team, leading political coverage on the state level. She has won multiple awards from the Utah Society of Professional Journalists. A Utah native, McKellar studied journalism at Dixie State University before graduating in 2014. David Noyes is managing editor of the Tribune, where he has worked since 1984. He oversees coverage ranging from the environment and public lands to alcohol policy, polygamy, and food. In addition, he directs religion reporting, co-hosts the award-winning Mormon Land, a podcast, and writes Mormon Land podcast and writes the Mormon Land newsletter. Professor Marcy Young-Cancio is a veteran newspaper reporter, magazine editor, and digital and television news executive. She joined Salt Lake Community College as assistant professor of journalism and digital media in 2018, and nearly 2 decades in Washington, D.C., New York, and after nearly 2 decades in Washington, D.C., New York, North Carolina, and California. In 2020, she launched Amplify Utah, a media literacy and engagement project, and serves as the nonprofit's executive director. Today's panel is moderated by Sheena McFarland, the marketing and communications director at the David Eccles School of Business. Sheena joined the Eccles School in January of 2015. For the decade prior to joining the university, Sheena was a reporter and editor at the Salt Lake Tribune, covering topics ranging from education to government to astronomy. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Ana Luisa, thank you so much for the wonderful introductions. So we got a little bit of information about you, but I'd love to just go down the line here and have you add just a little bit about information about what your experience has been in journalism and what that looks like and how that's shaping what you're doing now. So Marcy, you want to start?
Sure. So I've done a lot of different things in journalism. I started by getting 2 degrees in it, which is not totally necessary, but I committed, and have worked as a government and crime reporter in North Carolina, in New York. In New York, I was also a fashion editor at a business publication covering the global footwear industry. So my beat was women's high heel shoes, which is a real beat. It was awesome. And then I got into a lot of digital work I was the editor of Salt Lake Magazine here, and then moved to KUTV and then the ABC station in San Francisco where I led digital teams. So I just evolved with the journalism industry as the journalism industry evolved and kept kind of tucking my way up there until I joined Salt Lake Community College.
Lindsey?
I'm Lindsey Whitehurst. I work for Associated Press here in Salt Lake, and I've been with AP for about 7, going on 8 years. And prior to that, I was at the Salt Lake Tribune for about 6 years. And I'm originally from Illinois, and I went to college in Ohio and worked at a couple of papers in New Mexico and in Indiana before I came here. And working for AP, I cover just about everything from state politics to crime to even the Great Salt Lake, environmental issues, to polygamy sometimes, so it's a little bit of everything.
Hi, my name is Katie McKellar. I'm a political writer for Deseret News. I was recently promoted last year to be an assistant editor alongside that, so I am editing and writing. And I've been with the Deseret News for about 8 years, including internships right out of college and while I was going to college. And so, yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Dave Noyce. Last month, I celebrated my 38th anniversary at the Salt Lake Tribune. 38 years. I've been there 40 years in journalism total. I'm a local kid. I grew up in the west side of Salt Lake City, went to the University of Utah, graduated from here, lived a couple of years in Pennsylvania, but otherwise I've pretty much been a local. I can see now that I need to update my bio because some things have changed. I'm now over city and county coverage again, which is something I also spearheaded for about 13 years, but I'm back to having that also. Also religion coverage, which is a substantial beat in this state, and census, growth, those kinds of issues.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have a very experienced and expertise panel up here, so I'm excited to hear your perspectives on ethics in journalism, which has been the Ethics Week theme this year at the University of Utah. So why don't we just start in with the big question of why are ethics important in journalism, and what purpose do they serve both journalists and their readers or viewers and the general public? Someone want to start? Dave?
I guess I can go. I thought about this issue. She was asking about that, and ethics are important to all of us, of course. Ethics are personal life choices quite often. We all probably know people that start making what we would consider bad ethical choices. They may even be friends at one point. At some point, of course, those ethical choices may incline us to disassociate with them, to stop hanging out with them, to stop trusting them, and stop associating with them. Well, if you translate to the journalism world, our ethics are so valuable for some of the same reasons. We want people to hang out with us. We want people to read our stories, watch what we're reporting. We want them to consider them, if not friends, at least to respect us, and most of all, to trust us. So ethics are valuable and invaluable to building that trust, especially in this era.
I listened to Kelly McBride the other day, and she talked about how, you know, we're the watchdogs, and under the Constitution, the government can't put rules and regulations over the press. And that was so important to the founding fathers that that's in our Constitution. So there's not this overarching framework or government regulation that regulates us. We have to regulate ourselves, and we go by a code of ethics. And like what Dave said, you know, people aren't going to read us if they don't trust us. We're going to lose sources if you know, we're covering a community and then we burn trust for our sources and our community, and we'll become isolated, and then what will we understand about our community? And so ethics kind of drives everything that we do and what we stand for. And if we can't be watchdogs, if we can't watchdog ourselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that in addition to everything that both Dave and Katie said, I think there's sort of two layers of ethics when it comes to journalism. You're talking about ethical reporting when you go out and gather the information, the way you deal with people, the way that you explore the topic, and then you also have ethics as you write the story and the way the story is framed and the way that it goes out to the world, because our biggest responsibility is communication. You know, that's what we do, and how that story goes out to people, and to ensure that you're telling the fullest, most complete, fairest story possible. So you're really sort of looking at it from both of those dimensions, and it's equally important, I think, in both layers, at both times in the whole process.
And this isn't just some like willy-nilly approach. It's not like reporters are like, I need to be ethical, I need to be a good human. SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists, from where Kelly McBride, that Katie mentioned, is from, has a code of ethics. Similar to a code that doctors take, the oath that they take to do no harm, journalists also follow a code of ethics that follows similar principles in many ways: to do no harm, to bring in all of the things that Lindsey just talked about, to make sure that your reporting is accurate, fair, ethical. It's something that we follow. It's not just like a random standard of what it means to be ethical. There are guidelines that good journalists who are worth their salt, follow and feel very, very strongly about following. And if you meet a journalist who says that they don't really care about the code of ethics, then that should be a gigantic red flag in the quality of their standards, not just of their reporting, but of the publication or the outlets that they work for.
Excellent, thank you. And I know that ethics are an incredibly important part of journalism. Like Dave was talking about, when you have a friend who does something unethical, you might disassociate with them. If you are a journalist who does something unethical, you get fired. It's a big, like those are things you don't come back from, right? If I often, when I was an editor, would tell my reporters that in journalism, you have your byline and the ethics behind them and nothing else, right? So if you violate your ethics, you have nothing. And so it's really important to continue doing that. But it seems that even though ethics are so important and being fair and making sure that you're giving all sides of a story, I think everyone on this panel has probably been accused of being biased in your journalism, right? And not on the opinions page, but in the actual news pages. So when you have faced that criticism, how do you respond, and how do ethics help guide your coverage to be not biased?
I'd like to hear
I
from
can
the
start.
two active reporters first.
Well, I mean, so I work for the Deseret News, and the Deseret News is kind of considered the more conservative outlet here in Utah. Consider our ownership owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so we get that a lot, that you're biased. But I can also get, I work for the Utah In-Depth team, which is the team that covers, what's going on day to day in Utah, how it relates to, what's going on in the nation, and also just trying to stay plugged into our local news coverage here. And we get criticisms from the other side too, that we're too liberal. And so when you're kind of walking a fine line of, trying to be fair, accurate, and balanced, you're gonna get those criticisms from people who see those headlines about a story that they don't agree with, that they don't like. And you kind of have to realize that every single day when you write a story, you need to consider, someone from this angle, from this perspective is going to read this, and they're going to think it's biased, and then the other side, they're going to think the other way. And so you kind of are under this constant pressure of trying to make sure what you're writing is fair and accurate and balanced, and you double check that before you hit file, and then your editors double check that before it goes to print. And to me, like, when I'm getting criticisms from both sides on the same story, am I doing something right? So, yeah.
I think that's one point of view, right? If everyone is mad at you, then you must be doing something right. No, I think, historically speaking, to take a really long view, right? 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was sort of, the ethics weren't the same. There was sort of the old school, like, yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst, and those times when journalistic publications were often driving an agenda that was kind of in the past history of the publication of news. And so now, today, for at least several decades, the journalism world we were brought up in, and one that I think is really important, is the standard is you're going to write about an issue and you're going to get as many perspectives on it as you can, and you're going to ask for responses. Associated Press, you might know, is a wire service, and we have bureaus sort of all over the country, all over the world, and so we take the news from our patch and we sort of tell it to the rest of the world, right? And in media studies that people have done, AP almost always falls right there in the middle in terms of the place we want to be and where we're seen in objectivity. We want objectivity to be our goal, and to be able to hear from everybody and sort of represent all of those things, right? If somebody is accusing someone of something else, to always try and talk to that person to get their point of view. Even in crime stories, if you're going to write about somebody who's been accused of or charged with a crime, we always try and talk to them, talk to their attorney, to try and really get the fullest picture that we possibly can. And I think that's hopefully the best way to combat any allegations of bias, is to say these are all the steps we took to make sure we could get as many different points of view on this issue as possible.
At the Tribune, no doubt, on the opinion side, we are viewed as the more liberal or progressive newspaper and voice in the community. On the news side, though, we strive for the same goals Katie talked about. And we, too, hear it from both sides. Quite often when you actually talk to the readers or the listeners or whatever the case may be, you'll find out they really don't like what you quoted someone saying in the story. In other words, somehow that you think that too, and you may not, of course, as a personal journalist. So quite often they'll point there. I think it's very, very important, though, that when those cries are made, when complaints are made, that we're reflective about it. That we look at what did we write and how did we write it? Was it fair? Was it balanced? We're going to fail at times on that. And we have to acknowledge that and then try to make amends, whether it's a correction or whatever, or fleshing out a piece that we didn't maybe flesh out the way we should have. So it's really important that we don't just dismiss the cries when we hear that, because sometimes there may be something to that. And I know that there are sometimes when I look at, I don't think there's a day goes by I don't look at a story that we've written thinking we could have done that better. It doesn't mean it was an unethical choice. It's just like, we misspelled a word. That happens a lot, or things like that. But it could be something more serious, too. There's a side that's not represented we really should have tried to get.
I like another thing that Kelly McBride talked about, this age of distrust, and how in the past people have talked about not really wanting to see the sausage being made, like why we made the decisions we made, why we included certain quotes or didn't include something. And I think, I agree with her. We're getting to a point where people want to understand and need to understand journalism more. I think it kind of speaks to media literacy. If they were mad about a quote, are they mad at the journalist or the person who said it? But maybe we need to do a better job of showing people and explaining decisions we make for stories to help build, help people understand, but also trust.
And that's where, going off of what everyone said, transparency is so incredibly crucial. That's what everyone has said up here. But that transparency is that thing that allows journalists to be more trustworthy. I tell my students when they're going back to sources who want to see the story before it's published, we're not in the habit of sharing complete stories, and every newsroom's a little bit different on their approach on this, but we're not in the habit of sharing a complete story. But I will tell students to get them on the phone. You can read quotes back to them. You can give context back to your sources. We never, ever, ever, ever want a source to be surprised by what they read in one of the stories that we wrote. And that goes to the transparency. And that goes a long way in establishing trust and staving off accusations of bias. If they're participating in your story, they should know how they're going to be portrayed. That is just part of the transparency of doing the reporting and giving sources that opportunity to be able to say, yes, that's what I said, or to dispute maybe the context that it was provided in. And so I think that transparency goes a long way in both when you make a mistake and you mess up, like Dave said, and from the reporting at the very, very onset and throughout the whole process. It's a great way to build trust and, to reduce those accusations of bias.
Great. Dave, did you have something else you wanted to add on that? Okay, just making sure. Great. So we've talked, we've gone back 200 years to yellow journalism days, but just here in the 2000s, right, journalism has radically changed. With advent of new technologies, we have shrinking newsrooms, as we know, and we have the internet, which allows everyone in the whole wide world to put their opinions out in the world, and folks often will take those opinions as facts. And so how have those changes impacted how journalism is covered here in Utah and how you do your jobs on a daily basis?
I can start. I think, and this is kind of brutal, but the reality is as we've faced more and more, we've faced staff shortages, declining numbers in our newsroom, higher pressures in this changing digital age of no longer is the focus on, curating a newspaper and presenting what we think are the most important stories. These days we're kind of more driven by, what are people going to read, page views, maybe subscribers, these really hard pressures to keep us afloat. And, how do you reconcile that with, keeping your standards of journalism high, valuing those stories that are really important that take a lot of time and effort away from the daily grind of things. And I think it's just putting more pressure on that everyday journalist and managers and editors to put more focus on, you know, what stories you're actually turning out. Are they hitting that high bar? We're getting pulled in all sorts of different directions in this industry, and we're having to, the pressure's all just falling on us to try to make it work, and it's hard.
If you think you're tethered to your phones, be a journalist and see how tethered to your phone you are every time something happens. And the hard part's relentless. It doesn't stop. And so one of the keys to making good ethical choices is pausing to know that you have an ethical choice to make. The pressure's so quick to get that online, get this done, get this, get that. It can make it more difficult. So you have to think quicker, or else you just have to be willing to let the Deseret News have it first, for
Or the
instance.
Trib.
And say, but we want to get this, we want to get that for our readers. It doesn't mean that the Deseret News story was incorrect or wrong. It just means we want to get this part, that kind of a thing. So that's one of the difficulties, is the relentless pace. That's really changed in my long career.
Yeah, no longer is it that daily deadline, it's the every minute deadline.
Yeah, and it's tiring.
It is tiring.
And I'll talk. Everything they're saying is totally true and completely accurate. And I'll also talk a little bit just about some of the good things that social media has done. Right, like we've been able to, I think, hear voices from people that weren't necessarily always reflected in the pages in the newspaper or on the TV broadcasts. Like social media, I think, has helped bring some new perspectives into the world and into our reporting too. I mean, it's far from been all good in the social media ecosphere, right? But also reflects sort of some things about the world. But there's been, I think, some good things too, in the sense of being able to be in touch with your readers really quickly too. I mean, there's always, when you're deciding what stories to cover, there's sort of a balance between, like, some things are really important, but not necessarily the quote unquote sexiest story, the one that everybody's going to go straight to, but are really important for democracy. And then there's also, but it's also good to kind of hear from people and get that feedback and know what people are curious about, and being able to respond to that in a really quick way has been something that's kind of cool about social media becoming a bigger force in the world and in our profession.
Yeah, and building off of that, it's also changed the way that you can gather information and do reporting. The New York Times does visual investigations. There are these video reporting that's done in the same way as traditional reporting, and they did a really incredible one called Day of Rage that was released, I think, in September of last year, all about the January 6th riots at the Capitol. And the amount of reporting that went into that was absolutely phenomenal, pulling Freedom of Information, or putting in Freedom of Information Act's requests to be able to pull body cam footage from officers at the Capitol, putting in requests with a wide variety of social media companies to get video that was posted from every stage of that day. And they were able to cull hundreds of videos to be able to put together this reflective report of what was happening on the outskirts of the Capitol, what happened when the doors were breached, what happened on the inside. And they were able to not just report using all of these mediums, but to present it in a really compelling way that wasn't readily available in traditional forms of media before, where before we had radio, we had traditional broadcast television, and we had print, whether magazine or news. And this allowed like 3D visualizations to be able to be posted on the New York Times website, on YouTube, and to be shared broadly in a way that you can capture broader audiences. So the internet, guys, it's here to stay. I don't it's not going away. I think it's going to be here for a while. So newsrooms that are very effective at finding compelling ways to share those stories on the many platforms that are always shifting and evolving is factoring into how we approach the ethical conversation too, because we can't necessarily apply the old standard of what ethics means in journalism. We have to constantly be evolving and adapting it.
That's a perfect segue into my next question. So we've brought up Kelly McBride a few times. She was our Ethics Week keynote speaker. She's from Poynter and is an expert in journalism ethics. Many folks on this panel have reached out to her in times of question and gotten advice from her. But as she spoke to us, much like you're talking about, Marcy, she was talking about how as journalism has evolved, so too have the ethics. And so I would love for you to kind of give your perspective on, seeing more emphasis on things like community and transparency and inclusion, and what you've been seeing, how those ethics are changing along with the media environment, and what things are you still adhering to that are kind of the constant standards in journalism ethics, and what things have you kind of been seeing evolve over time?
Well, I know I just spoke, but I'll talk again. So one of the things that from what I do as a professor of an assistant professor of journalism, I also launched a nonprofit called Amplify Utah, and we did this in partnership with the Salt Lake Tribune. We received Google News Initiative funding to do this, but it is meant to be working with all local media across the state. But we launched this initiative to increase representative storytelling in local media. So tapping into the rich, diverse stories that are coming out of Salt Lake Community College, which two-year schools and community colleges are naturally the most diverse institutes of higher education in any given state, although colleges and universities are always going to be very diverse and reflective. So pulling stories from across those communities that are reflective of the broader Salt Lake community. And my journalism students are writing those stories, working with the sources to help amplify their voices. And then our partnership with the Tribune, they run through a very strict editing process with me, with editors at the Tribune, and then they're published in the Salt Lake Tribune. So these are stories that are often not regularly being covered by news organizations, not for lack of want, but because of access, because of shrinking newsrooms, a wide variety of things. And so over the last year, we've published more than 24 stories, focusing on the value of, focusing on dead names to laptops in the prison education system, a really broad range of things. And as our societies shift and change, this is an ethics question, because who are we covering? What voices are going unheard? You guys may have heard that adage of journalists give a voice to the voiceless. That's BS. It's total BS. Everybody has a voice, right? They just might not have that platform to be able to amplify it on. And so part of the responsibility, I feel very strongly about this, if you can't tell by the change in my tone, part of the responsibility of journalists is to adapt to the mediums that we have to be able to help amplify those voices, to amplify the voices that aren't regularly heard in our mainstream media. And we have to shift and evolve and change with the way our media landscape is changing to ethically do our jobs in the media landscape. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, because historically, right, there were a lot of people that made up the fabric of America who were not necessarily represented in the pages of newspapers or the dominant media at the time. And so that's been, I think, in the last couple of years especially, a real reckoning that a lot of news outlets have gone through, or what are the ways in which we haven't necessarily met that responsibility of giving voice to the voiceless, historically speaking, and how can we kind of do that going forward? And how can we start to look at issues that we're covering with a framework that includes, the context in which things are happening, and includes some of that background that we didn't always include. How can we do that consistently too, even in a breaking news story? How can we try and make sure that both, there's the he said and the she said, and meaning the two or more sides that have an interest in this issue, and then there's also sort of this broader context too, that how can we get all of those different elements in the story, and I think all of those are really important, and it's something that's still evolving, but something that I think there's been a lot of progress on in the last few years, especially in journalism.
Yeah, really good points. And I mean, think about all the things we have to think about when you think about the changing landscape and how do you adapt, the way you do your job and how do you remember your ethics. Again, this environment of this digital age, it's really easy to kind of just get lost in this drumbeat of let's just get the story up, let's just get the story up. But we also should always look for and be on the watch for opportunities when we need to, like what Dave said, take a breath and think, should we be publishing this story right now? Does it deserve more time? We can do that too. We don't have a daily newspaper to fill anymore. So these are just these are decisions that we need to just be on guard for and don't fall for this constant, we need to get the story up now and not think more about the larger issue, what deserves more context, and whose voices have we not thought of or not included. We have that opportunity now to do it. We just can't get lost in the digital demand.
I don't think any of us have given up on the main goal is to pursue truth. Of
Yeah.
course, that's what we're trying to do. But the avenues to get there have changed, and it's a little bit more difficult, and it certainly is not the only goal now, especially, and it probably never should have been. I was thinking about something Marcy said, because like I said, I grew up on the west side of Salt Lake City, Glendale, and I still have family in Poplar Grove in that area. I have a Report for America reporter now who's covering the west side of Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County, but right now we're focusing a lot on Salt Lake City. A beautiful community, wonderful community, rapidly changing, evolving community, in some respects a microcosm of what's happening in the state. And the stories that can come out of there can be so impactful and so meaningful, and they're just not usually have not been represented. And the sad thing is the residents there don't even look to us to find out information. We still had a lot of trust we still need to gain there. We still need we need to get more contact with them. We're having community events so that they get to understand us. We get to understand them. You know, there's language barriers. There can be all kinds of different ethical, cultural barriers that we're trying to bridge so that we can have meaning in their lives. So much of what happens in this state is dictated in that context from the east side of the valley versus the west side of the valley. And the east side makes things happen, the west side has things happen to them. That's how it's perceived, and that's too often how it's true. And that's an ethical choice we need to make as journalists. We need to make sure we represent those issues, those things that the same concerns are there: education, healthcare, all those different things. But the answers to getting them might be different. So we need to make sure we're including their voices. We're including women's voices. We're including LGBTQ voices. We need to make sure all those voices are represented in our paper and in our stories, you know, when they're applicable.
And also not just from a tokenizing perspective of it's a story about LGBTQ plus issues, that you're interviewing trans individuals, that you're interviewing like for stories that don't have anything to do with trans stories, right? Because that's part of the visibility. If you're only interviewing a trans woman about issues, about trans issues or LGBTQ plus issues, you're not truly offering visibility and representation, right? You're going to them and tokenizing them for just that one thing that you think they can talk about. But they might be a resident of Glendale and talking about gentrification in their neighborhood, and they might have something really important to say about that has absolutely nothing to do with their gender identity, right? So it's making sure that we are thinking about people more broadly and not in the buckets that we've put them in. And going on what Dave said as well, I mean, in some communities like Glendale and Poplar Grove and Rose Park, there's a paper out there called Westview Media that creates a paper for those communities. And it's online, but it's also delivered for free to the homes in a print version every month, because understanding that there is a technological divide in some of these communities where they might not have the money or the ability to have a Wi-Fi connection or computer in their homes. So those are the inequities too that are a real ethical conversation in understanding how information is delivered. Just because we may all be connected through our cell phones doesn't mean everybody in our communities are, but that doesn't mean that they're any less in need of the information and the reporting that's being done in good journalism. So it's very leveled. There's many, many layers, like an onion or a cake.
Let's go with cake. Now, and I hope that everyone who is listening and watching right now is understanding just these are the conversations and the things that are always in the back of minds of journalists and often in front of conversations, right? So this is not something that oh, we had our monthly check-in about ethics and we're just going to move on, right? This is stuff that is driving you all the time, which I think is an incredibly important thing that I think often gets overlooked from the general public. But I do want to talk about a time that you have had to face an ethical dilemma as a journalist or in your newsroom. And I'd love to have you share kind of what the process of working on that, figuring out how to navigate the situation, and then what the impact of your final decision was and how that went. So anyone want to share be vulnerable with us for a moment and talk about a time that was not awesome?
I can think of one. It was a while ago, but so I cover like a lot of growth issues. Like I like cover politics, but I also cover like lately I've been covering the housing market and just like how communities are getting impacted by growth and development. And it's a big issue in the state. And a while ago, so I live in this community called Erda, which is in Tooele County, way out west. And it's a high growth community, and there's a lot happening as far as development goes. And my neighborhood was directly getting impacted by our proposed development, like right there, like it would be right part of our neighborhood in this open field. And my neighborhood had a lot of strong feelings about it. I had strong feelings about it. It fell on my beat, and I'm like, I just don't think I can do the story. Like it's something that would directly impact my house, like just a few houses down. Didn't feel right to be the one to do the story.
Is that the church's development?
It was Skywalk.
Oh, okay.
So different.
Okay.
But there was a bunch of other projects going on out there. But so I just decided to kind of step back. We had plenty of reporters who could work on it, and I pitched it to one of my coworkers, and it caught her interest, and she did the story. I didn't have anything to do with the editing or anything for it. And so that's just sometimes the decisions you have to make. Do you have strong feelings about something that you can't separate? Would it directly impact your house or your property or your neighbors? So, you'll come across that every once in a while, especially if you're covering an issue like that. So.
Well, these happen far too often, I'm afraid, sometimes. But if you were ever in a newsroom, and we haven't been in newsrooms for a while now, for a couple of years, it's just starting to come back. But these kind of conversations happen a lot. Sheena knows, of course, a lot more than I think people appreciate. My spouse could tell you about how we live with them, too, because they hear about it, too. The choices that you have to make. I thought of several as you were talking. And some of them I don't want to talk about. It's still too painful, but especially one of them. But just last year, I think it was just last year, a student was abducted or went missing. Made lots of news, and they started to fear she had been abducted. And so naturally, these alerts went out, so we were giving just who she was, her description of what she was last seen wearing, all these different things. They find her later, and it comes out she had been, allegedly, it hasn't been adjudicated fully yet, sexually assaulted. And some details of the sexual assault that were really hard, which we don't generally, we don't publish details about that. But we also generally don't name a sexual assault victim. So now we had a choice. Now we know she's at least allegedly a sexual assault victim, so our policy is we don't name her. But her name's already been out there. We've already printed that name. We chose, of course, we had a debate, question, back and forth, and we actually settled on this more rapidly than we normally do, to now pull her name back. And so now we no longer name it, even though other media reporting the name still, it was still out there, it could still be found. So those are the kinds of more common, unfortunately in this case, ethical choices that you have to make.
I also covered that story actually, and this is also a case of where different media outlets have different roles in the ecosystem. Like, so AP hadn't done the missing persons case because it
She
hadn't
faced that issue.
Right, so we hadn't put her name out yet, partly because we have a much smaller staff. There are two of us at the time. There was one of us reporting in Utah. So we have a smaller staff, and we tend to focus on those stories that will generate kind of national interest, statewide interest, things like that. And I don't remember the exact reason why point, we hadn't done the missing person thing, but we hadn't, so we didn't have that particular choice. But I remember, so when I was writing about it, it was when the charges were filed and when it had become known that there was an assault involved, an alleged assault involved, and so what we do behind the scenes is have a conversation with our editors. And I read the details that were in there, and I said, I don't think we should use this girl's name. And because we hadn't reported it before, and when she was a missing person, of course, we didn't have that knowledge. We knew she was gone, and we knew that there was a guy involved, but that could be all kinds of different things, especially because she was an adult. She is an adult. She was 19 years old, a young adult, but an adult person. So that could mean all kinds of different things, right? And so when she's missing and you're trying to find her, it makes sense to put her name and her picture out there. And that's one role of the media, to get the word out, in case anybody's seen this girl. And so when I came in, I was just looking at the charges, and I thought, now that she's been found, and so there's no longer that interest in needing to find her, we know where she is, and now we do have this knowledge of what has allegedly happened to her, I didn't think we should name her. So I talked to my editors about it, and I said, hey, this is the situation, here are some of the details from the report. I think we shouldn't use her name, and they agreed with me in that particular case. And so you have that conversation between editors and reporters, and there can be differences of opinion on things like this, but especially somebody who's a young person, even though she is a legal adult, she's still young, and considering the details of the situation, I thought, nope, we shouldn't name her. And some publications kept her name out there. I remember it made it to People magazine at one point, and they still had her name and her photo, and I was kind of like, I'm not privy to their conversations, but I was thinking, I make a different decision in that particular case.
Yeah. And that, so something to always think about is, just because you can report it doesn't mean you have to report it. And it's bringing that gauge in of what does the public actually need to know? Do they need to know some of the sordid details? And this was, I'm sure, a lot of conversations that was happening in newsrooms when Lauren McCluskey was killed in that very long case. There was a lot of information coming out. How much does it pertain to the story? How much is it just salacious detail that does not need to be shared? Just because you have access to that information, whether it's a detail of a story that you're covering already, or it's a story that you're deciding to run at all, does the public need to know? Or is it just clickbait? Is it just something that's gonna rev your numbers up? When I was in a television newsroom here in Salt Lake, I have a very, very distinct example of a story that we just should not have run, and that we could put the kibosh on all stories like this. I oversaw the digital team, so in addition to the reports that were being done by reporters, the digital team is constantly feeding the website with interesting stories that are meant to be engaging, posting it to social media, again, with that idea of it should be really engaging and getting people to click on it. Well, we found a story that wasn't even from Utah, but it ran in one of the other markets, and we had a sharing system with our other stations, and it was about a man who was arrested for forcing a sexual act onto a puppy. It was horrible and disgusting, and tons of people clicked on it, and tons of people unfollowed us, and were disgusted by it and angry by it. And our team learned that, the person who posted that learned the hard way, but our whole team learned the lesson of, just because it's out there and just because another news organization decided to do it, doesn't mean it has any inherent value for a public audience. It's just gross and icky. No more stories like this, period. Just because we have it doesn't mean we should share it. So there's those questions that should be asked too, and that's part of the responsibility that goes into that code of ethics with reporters of how you make those decisions.
And just an addendum, because this came up in the conversation, the typical modern standard for sexual assault, sexual abuse, is to ask the person if that's a possibility. Do you want your name? Because some people, of course, they do want to share their stories and they want their names out there. So now, that wasn't always the case. I think this actually came about only in the 1960s that became sort of the standard practice. But that's the practice now, is if there's a way to ask the person themselves and say, do you want your name? And then if they say yes, then go ahead and publish it. If they say no, don't. And that's like everything, there are some slight gradations and different things, but that's pretty much industry standard practice now, is ask the person and only use it if they agree to that.
And that can get really tricky, in particular with sexual abuse cases of children, where an adult or a relative is connected to them, and you are reporting on the charges against that adult, so their name is typically out there. So you then will not want to identify the victim as their niece or their brother.
Or sometimes not even identify the adults at
right?
all.
Exactly.
And so it just depends. So if you choose, for example, to identify the adult because maybe it's a, like maybe it's a habitual thing or something, if you choose to identify that adult, then you would say like, you would not even say a relative of, you would just say a 13-year-old child, right? You might not even do their gender, so you can put as much space between the accused and the victim as possible. So it makes it hard for that connection to be made and identify that victim.
Great, thank you for sharing. I know that like Dave was talking about bringing this home, all of the journalist spouses, right, have to hear us process through these issues that we face every day, and they're not easy decisions to make, right? And you're going to come to different conclusions based on what your role in the community is, what your news outlet is like, those kinds of things. And just because one person does it one way doesn't mean it's right or wrong if someone else does it the other way, right? So ethics can be a little bit interesting in their flexibility a little bit in context, right? And why those change depending on where your perspective is coming from. But as we're getting close to time, I kind of want to wrap the next two questions together a little bit we've talked a little bit about the erosion of trust that has been happening over the last few years in journalism, and that misinformation and disinformation are on the rise. There's a lot of really bad information out there. So I want to know both how that might be impacting how you cover things, or if it's harder for you to get your voice in a trustworthy place out there, and also how do folks in our audience figure out how to get good, solid information and not fall for misinformation or disinformation?
Yeah, I can think about a couple times at Capitol Hill during the session this year. There were some committee hearings that had some people kind of showing up with some, wild ideas of conspiracy theories, or just kind of, was it the digital driver's license bill? That one that kind of drove a lot of people into thinking that it had something, I can't remember exactly what they were saying, but there was some wild stuff happening, and you kind of have to make a decision of like, okay, how do we cover this? How do you kind of, obviously if they're gonna say something, you need to point out that it's obviously without evidence or is unfounded, and you need to be very explicit about that in your reporting. And we also made, so I was editing this story, our intern wrote the story, but I edited it, and he reached out to a University of Utah academic to kind of give voice and analysis. Why is this happening? Why are people coming to Capitol Hill with this misinformation and conspiracy theories? How do you unpack it? We kind of wanted to take more of an approach of analysis and what to do with it. What does it mean for our political climate right now? I think you kind of have to go above it. Not only just point out it's wrong, but also analyze it, like, why is this happening? Here's what's true and here's what's not, and help your readers really understand what's going on. And I think that's one way to tackle it. But another thing to me too is, I think it was like a flat earth documentary I watched a while ago. Like, why do people believe the earth is flat? Like, why are there these like growing groups of conspiracy theories? Why is this becoming so pervasive? And one thing that really stuck out to me about that is you have to kind of come from a place of compassion. A lot of people might gravitate toward these theories in these communities because they feel like they're not welcomed, or they're, there's this feeling that they don't belong, and they're looking for some place to belong. So you have to, as you're reporting on these issues, try to come from a place of compassion and education, and not, egging them on by teasing them about some ridiculous thing that they believe. You should point out it's wrong in your reporting, and it doesn't have any evidence, or it's unfounded, but you shouldn't also be not compassionate and just kind of drive them away from accurate sources by teasing them. You need to treat people with respect, because that's kind of what drives these people toward these types of theories in the first place, is what I've tried to remember. So
Yeah, and as consumers, as readers, as people who are engaging with not just journalistic media content, but all media content, which is everything, right? That's billboards, it's buses, it's the ads that pop up on your phone, it's everything, right? Mass media is everything. You pay attention to what feels off. You guys are all smart enough to have a radar that's like, that's not quite right, right? So be aware of that. Be aware that you are in awash in messages all of the time on social media, from the things that you stream, from the magazines and the book, like from everything that you engage with. You are awash in messages. And so be aware that you are just being inundated constantly, and be aware of what feels off and what feels right. And it's okay to like click on the story about Pete Davidson and Kanye fighting, right? Like, it's candy, you know, like it's fine to click on that. Don't beat yourself up because you like trashy news. I subscribed to Us Weekly for far too long. It's okay, but also be aware of the differences between the news, the information that you're getting. When you follow trusted news sources, and don't just follow one, read both the Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News. Read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post. Have a wide variety of sources, because if you see similar threads between the reporting that's being done in all of those outlets, it's probably true. It's probably accurate. If you click on a story and you see that there's no quoted sources, there's nobody that's named by first and last name and has their title or their expertise, that's a giant red flag that the information in that story is probably bogus. So be aware of the things that make content trustworthy, because when you click on those things from your Twitter feed, or you see something on TikTok, we have not even touched TikTok, that's a whole different panel. Like, it's so easy to make stuff up, right? Fact check yourself. Google is an incredible tool for finding accurate information and for fact checking things. Snopes is a great tool, honestly. Like, fact check it. If it feels off in any of the mediums, fact check it. Look it up. Right? If a source, even named by first and last name, says something that's really wonky and weird, Google their name with wherever they're supposed to be from. Look at about the organizations. If you hear that milk is a life-saving drug, and if you drink 4 glasses of milk every day, you're gonna form superhero strength, go and see where that study came from, and you'll probably find that it was sponsored by the Milk Council, the Dairy Council, right? Like, look for those sorts of things that tip you off. Be curious.
I think that's so important. I mean, like, we're kind of in this age where we're flooded with information, and without media literacy, you will not understand what's real and what's not. And I get increasingly concerned about people who just don't know how to consume media these days and know what's reputable and sourcing and what's not. And I don't really know what the answer is, but media literacy is so important, and it's maybe helping your neighbors and your parents or your friends, like, kindly double checking or kind of checking them and saying, where did you hear that? Instead of like teasing them and then pushing them away to, you know, we need to help people become more media literate. And I really think we need to do it in an empathetic way, or else people are not going to listen.
Yeah, because it has to be a two-way road, right? You can't just hold journalists fully accountable for the ethics and information. It's the responsibility of everybody in this room, everyone who's consuming, right? Like, there's also an ethical news consumer, right? So it's a two-way street, and it's so easy to blame like the media, right? This monolithic media, and we put it all in a pile. There's responsibility on both sides, and we all have to, you know, that's kind of how democracy works, so.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to open it up for questions, but before we do, let's give these folks a round of applause for sharing this expertise with us. I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 quick questions if there are any in the audience. So if you'll raise your hand.
Just let me know and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you guys for a great panel today. I follow a lot of, at least the Tribune's investigative reporting. I love it. I was wondering if you guys have a memorable story, like where your team like really uncovered something interesting or cool that you remember.
I was over our coverage of, this may predate some of you, I mean, at least your awareness, John Swallow, Mark Shurtleff, Attorney General, scandal. It was a scandal. That was a really, really difficult time to went for about 2.5 years. I used to have tally the number of stories we did. One year was like 244, and most of them were major stories. In fact, it really, one of my chief reporters on it, it tore apart his family. It was very difficult because, frankly, because of the long hours too. We were editing stories late at night. But the thing that was so memorable about that is you read about scandals in like Chicago or New York and barroom deals being taking place and things like that. The thing I love about the Utah twist on this scandal was that the Wayne revelatory tape come from a conversation at a Krispy Kreme donut shop. And that's my favorite part of the whole story. Some significant reforms came out of that. The two principals one was tried and acquitted, frankly, because we think prosecutors messed up the case and aimed a little too high. That's our perspective looking back. The other one was the case was never actually brought to trial. That's one that comes right to mind.
Excellent. Lindsey, please.
This is not quite as exciting, but it's recent. I recently wrote a story about this was back like last April, I think, a year or so ago. That was the first to say that Great Salt Lake was going to hit a historic low, and that to me was really important, and not to like toot my own horn or anything, mostly because I happened to be the one, I think, asking questions about it at that particular time. But I think that it was a story that felt really, I was really proud of, because I was able to bring together a lot of threads that had been talked about and kind of known, but kind of that piece of information that it was about to hit this historic low tied together with a lot of information that we knew about the exposed lake bed and stuff like that, really helped illuminate this issue that had kind of gone under the radar a little bit, at least recently, and helped to drive some change. I was not the only one to write about it. The Tribune's done some great work on this issue. The Deseret News has. Definitely not the only outlet to write about it ever, but I was really proud of what our work kind of added to that issue, because it helped really make it urgent, and there's some new money going towards it now after the legislative session this year. So yeah, I thought that was cool.
I want to hear what Katie's story is, but I do want to follow up on this and let you all know that in part of this conversation about ethics, there's a group called the Solutions Journalism Network. It's a national group out of New York that was started by two reporters from the New York Times that is focused on solutions-based journalism. And trying to find solutions to big, pressing, important issues. And so Salt Lake, Utah has just earned one of these grants to be able to do solutions-based reporting, and we're doing it on the Great Salt Lake. And it is a collaborative with more than a dozen local newsrooms and more than half a dozen community partners that include the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, Amplify Utah, students at Salt Lake Community College, KCBW, KUER, KRCL, Westview Media, who we talked about, Ogden Standard Examiner, UPR, other folks that I'm missing in here. So if you guys are watching, sorry, I love all of you. This collaborative's amazing. But this group, for the next 2 years, will be doing stories of impact and solutions around the Great Salt Lake. So when you talk about combining a story of impact with what we're here talking about today, ethics and journalism, we are putting aside competition to be able to work together as journalists and news outlets to tell an important story of impact, to come up with solutions that will affect everybody in this room, everyone in this state. And it's really an exciting way to think about how journalists are adapting to those ethical changes. So watch for it. You can see this in all of those news media organizations that I talked about. The stories are starting to roll out now, and we'll be doing this for 2 years. We're thinking about like gameplay and apps and like a lot of things to make it really engaging as well. So anyhow, that nicely. Sorry.
No, you get it. My story was from a while ago, and it was kind of a strange story. But the investigation for it landed me a couple awards, including an ethics award from SPJ, and it had to do with a former Salt Lake County recorder named Gary Ott, who had Alzheimer's. But we didn't know he had Alzheimer's at the time, but there were a lot of people around him who were concerned about what was happening to him. He didn't seem to be, behaving correctly. Things were just strange, and we got tipped off about it. And the approach to this story was, we really had to think about ways to try to be empathetic, but also point out a big problem. What happens when you have an elected official that doesn't have all of his faculties? And it had everything from body camera footage in like remote Tooele County when he ran out of gas and wasn't really making sense when he was talking to police, to concerns from employees at the county that the people around him were thinking more about the position and the money with that position rather than, should he still be working and collecting taxpayer money right now? It was a really hard story, and also just had lots of twists and turns in it that, over the course of a year or years, had a lot of interesting headlines, and we just had to remember while reporting on it how to be compassionate to this man who obviously was suffering from a horrible disease. And it was quite a ride. Ultimately he did resign with the help of the district attorney and his family. Then there was a lawsuit, and it was just like crazy. So
Remember those stories?
yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us and to share your incredible experiences and to shed more light onto ethics in journalism and the importance of it. So one more time, a round of applause for our panelists.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.